Hey guys, welcome back to Bible Bites. Do you ever just feel like there's things that come in waves, whether it's, frustration, just circumstances of life? Well, the disciples experienced this exact same thing, and I was going to get into that today in Matthew. So open your Bibles and let's get to it. All right, let's start in Matthew. It's 14, 22 through 34. So I'm going to cover this fairly quickly and then we're going to get into it. It says, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that the disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. The disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. After they had crossed the lake, they landed at the other side. So, this is so much to unpack right here. First, I want to cover, like in verse 22, it said, immediately after this, Jesus insisted the disciples cross over. So this tells us they were in the will of God. Jesus was telling them what to do. So the disciples were in the perfect will of God. But what happened when they were on the water is this heavy storm with these big waves just kept coming wave after wave and just battering the boat till they literally thought they were going to die. And, there's times in life where it just seems like we just are getting hit from every direction, wave after wave of, this circumstance or that circumstance. And it just is like overwhelming sometimes. And we're just like, God, I feel like I'm doing what you're asking me to do. I feel like I'm, doing everything in my power to do the right thing. And I'm just getting battered. And the thing is, even when you're in the will of God, we're still living in a fallen world, and there's still sin that is very present, and things happen. We're still going to experience, trials and tribulations, and it just feels like it comes in waves sometime. But what's interesting is they were afraid, and they called out thinking it was a ghost, and Jesus immediately, sometimes we have voices in our head. We're like, is that God? Is that my thoughts? Is that, Satan? But cry out, and ask, like, God, help me quiet all the voices that are not of you. Let me hear your voice. And he'll meet you right where you're at. And he did. And he was like, don't be afraid. It's me. And Peter, out of all the disciples, only one was like, if that is you, bid me to come walk on the water. And he was like, well, come on. Sometimes we don't want to step out of our comfort zone. We don't want to step out of the what's not norm, and trust God in bigger and better things. Even though we have faith, sometimes we don't want to test it. It's like we don't want to go through we want to have faith for like maybe just daily things, but nothing big. Therefore, we never get to experience anything bigger than what a lot of the average people do. And Peter was the only one that experienced walking on water. And that was because he asked Jesus, like, if this is you, call me out. We need to ask God, call us out to bigger things. Give us the faith to do this. And he did. He walked on water. The interesting thing is, it said in verse 29, Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. He had his eyes on Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind, well, you don't see wind, you see the effects of wind. So he saw his circumstances. The thing is, we have to shift our focus. When we start looking at our circumstances, we have to shift our focus back on Jesus. Well, Peter did the opposite. He had his eyes on Jesus, and then he shifted his focus onto his circumstances, and he started to sink. And there's times when those waves of life are just coming, and we feel battered, and we feel beat down emotionally and spiritually and physically, that our focus shifts, and our circumstances are so in our face, it's hard, to keep our eyes on Jesus. And that's what Peter did. He shifted his focus onto his circumstances, and immediately he started to go underwater. He started to drown. But what he did do is he recognized, that he was in trouble. A lot of times we just try to doggy paddle and just keep our head above water. And I feel like if we're truly honest with ourselves, most of us feel like that most of the time, like just, barely keeping our head above water, whether it's financially or raising kids or in our marriage or our careers. We were never meant to live like this. And Peter, he immediately called out to Jesus. He didn't try to do it on his own. He didn't think like I can swim, back to the boat on my own. He immediately recognized that these circumstances were way more than he could handle. And he cried out to Jesus. And it says, Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith. Well, he didn't say he didn't have any faith. He said he had little faith. And that's exactly. So my question is, it would take big faith to go overboard in a boat, to walk on water where there's a storm. That would be big faith. So what happened from the point of having, big faith, which was in verse 29, where it says he went over the side of the boat, to verse 31, where Jesus had to grab him and tell him he had little faith? The only thing that happened between those two verses is Peter shifted his focus off of Jesus and onto his circumstances. So that should be a huge life lesson for us. And what's interesting is they went back together. Jesus didn't say, here, and pulled him back up to the top of the water and go back to the boat by yourself. I'm so disappointed in you. No, they walked hand in hand back to the boat. And it says, after they had crossed the lake. Well, that's in verse 34. In John 6:21, that verse, it's covering the same story, but John says they immediately were at shore. They immediately crossed, which means, sometimes Jesus does stuff immediately in our life, and sometimes he doesn't, but that's not up to us. All we are responsible for is to shift our focus from our circumstance back to Jesus. And the first thing that you can take from this story is know your guide, know your word, know when you're in the will of God and when you're out of the will of God. That is our plumb line. And two, know if the way you're living your life or the circumstances you're in, lines up with that word. So you have to know your word, and you have to make sure that your life lines up with that word. And then three, you have to make sure that your focus is shifted onto Jesus if it is not. So if your focus is shifted onto your circumstance or anything else, you have to shift back to Jesus and keep your focus on him so you can walk above your circumstances and not drowned and feel like they're just too overwhelming and start losing heart. So if you do feel like you're drowning, you do feel like you're just barely keeping your head above water, cry out to Jesus immediately, and he will pull you back up and just shift your focus back to him. Walk back to safety with Jesus. Stay in the boat with Jesus. So I love you guys. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.